with some breaking news now, and hundreds of small boat migrants are heading to the UK this morning after bad weather prevented any illegal crossings for the past month.
Over 40,000 illegal migrants, nearly £3 billion a year wasted from British taxpayers. For months, pressure has been building quietly. Hotels stretched, budgets strained, communities left to absorb the impact. After 28 days of silence, the boats are back. At least 7 vessels confirmed. Hundreds have just set foot in the UK. That was the final straw. And within hours, Britain begins to erupt. By late morning, the reaction moved off the coastline and into the streets. At 11:20 a.m, crowds began gathering outside council buildings in several major cities. By 12:05, roads were blocked. Public transport slowed. Police units were redeployed away from routine duties. The message was no longer about boats, it was about pressure. In London, small groups formed first, then merged. In Birmingham, officers reported a rapid increase in calls linked to public disorder. By 13:40, police confirmed that resources were being stretched simultaneously across multiple urban areas. Shops began pulling shutters down, bus routes were diverted, local councils issued public safety notices urging people to avoid city centres. What began as isolated gatherings was now spreading faster than authorities could contain. By mid-afternoon, the tone hardened, chants grew louder, tempers shortened, police commanders shifted posture from dispersal to containment. This was no longer a single protest, it was a chain reaction. The return of the boats had not caused the anger, it had unlocked it. Not long after, the pressure finally snapped. At 16:10, police lines were reinforced again, not to disperse crowds, but simply to hold ground. Moments later, flares were lit, bottles were thrown. Officers were forced back from key junctions. The tone changed. By 17:05, emergency units were redeployed across multiple cities at once. Response times slowed. Local commanders warned that resources were being stretched beyond operational planning. This was no longer crowd management, it was damage control. As evening approached, the disorder spread. Residents were advised to remain indoors. Police confirmed multiple incidents linked to confrontation and public disorder. Internally, the situation was described as volatile and unpredictable. By 1940, the scale was undeniable. Officers were locked into defensive positions. Command structures fractured. Decisions became reactive, not strategic. The state was no longer setting the pace, it was chasing events. This was the moment Britain realised the pressure had not merely surfaced, it had broken. As the night wore on, the cost became visible. Police confirmed dozens of officers injured across multiple cities, several required hospital treatment. Emergency services reported scores of civilians hurt amid clashes, stampedes and falling debris.
Attention, this is a basic warning. Disperse immediately or water cannon will be used.
By late evening, authorities acknowledged over 100 arrests linked to public disorder, criminal damage and assaults on officers. These were not isolated incidents, they were spread geographically and simultaneously, and yet the response from the centre remained familiar. Statements were issued, calm was urged, the language was careful, the tone restrained. Responsibility was deflected sideways, local commanders were praised, police professionalism was highlighted. But the underlying question was avoided. Why had the system allowed conditions to deteriorate this far? From the Home Office, there was no admission of failure, only reassurance that reviews were underway. From local authorities, appeals for patience. From senior figures, warnings about misinformation and unhelpful rhetoric. What was missing was acknowledgement, no recognition that repeated warnings had been ignored, no acceptance that pressure had been stored, not managed. For many watching, the contrast was stark. When order broke down, enforcement was immediate. Batons raised, arrests made, charges prepared. But the decisions that led here, the delays, the deferrals, the silences, carried no visible consequence. This is where anger hardens. Not in the chaos itself, but in the realisation that accountability flows downward while responsibility dissolves upward. What unfolded was not just disorder, it was the exposure of a system more comfortable managing the aftermath than confronting the cause. As the disorder subsided, the cost became clearer. The impact was real, the response familiar. Behind the scenes, the numbers were already moving faster than the statements. At Ramsgate, additional Border Force assets left port to meet incoming vessels. In the Channel, French escort boats were seen accompanying small craft across open water. Along the Kent coastline, officials prepared for what reliably follows a surge. Processing, transport, temporary accommodation, then the slower administrative phase that rarely reaches the headlines. The public sees the boats, the system sees the bill. Because once arrivals reach land, costs do not pause with the weather. They continue hour by hour, day by day. Contracts, security, catering, private accommodation, casework backlogs, legal appeals, emergency staffing. If Britain is spending over £8 million a day on wider support and accommodation, that is not a headline figure. It is an annualised reality. £8 million a day becomes roughly £2.9 billion a year. Funded by the same tax base, already under pressure from rising living costs and stretched public services. What fuels frustration is not only the scale, but the sense of permanence. Bad weather can pause crossings, it cannot pause expenditure, it cannot undo contracts already signed. It cannot relieve local services already operating at capacity. So when the boats returned after 28 days, it did not feel like a restart, it felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the system has no off switch, only backlogs, only queues, only decisions deferred to tomorrow. And in many towns, tomorrow has been arriving for years. Local councils absorb impacts they did not set, housing lists lengthen, GP appointments become harder to secure. Police time shifts from prevention to constant response, not by choice but by capacity limits. When pressure is treated as temporary, planning never adjusts to reality. Emergency measures become routine. That is the mechanism beneath public disorder. Not one dramatic decision, but repeated deferral. A system that expands obligations while narrowing control. From the centre, promises can be made. Order, toughness, new measures. But when the underlying machinery remains unchanged, those promises lose weight. The pattern becomes familiar. Weather blocks crossings, numbers dip, expectations rise, then conditions change and the cycle resumes. Even criminal networks plan around this reality. They respond to enforcement that is continuous and credible, not to statements. This leaves a question many people quietly ask. If the state can mobilise quickly after unrest breaks out, why does urgency arrive so late when warnings are still confined to reports and briefings? That gap does not provoke anger alone. It breeds cynicism. When people believe a system manages optics more readily than pressure, trust erodes. And when trust thins, resilience weakens. What unfolded was not simply disorder, it was the exposure of a system more accustomed to managing consequences than preventing failure. That is a fragile foundation. This is no longer about one night of unrest. It is about what happens when pressure is stored, not released responsibly. When communities are asked to absorb impacts indefinitely, when feedback loops break, when early warnings are treated as noise. Over time, the cost compounds, trust thins, compliance weakens. Interventions become reactive rather than preventative. The system learns the wrong lesson. That calm equals consent and silence equals approval. But calm can be temporary, silence can be forced. And when both break, the correction is rarely gentle. A state that manages crises without addressing causes invites repetition, not because people want disorder, but because unresolved pressure seeks an outlet. The long-term risk is not louder protests. It is a society that stops believing problems will be met early, fairly and honestly. There is a moral lesson here. Order cannot be demanded while accountability is delayed. Stability cannot be preserved by asking communities to absorb pressure alone. A government earns legitimacy not by managing fallout, but by preventing failure. If responsibility continues to thin as it rises through the system, the next crisis will not be unexpected. It will be the result of choices deferred for too long. The question is whether those in power are willing to confront pressure early or continue to delay until consequences can no longer be ignored.